Mr. Vincent Michael with the San Antonio Conservation Society. He was generous to come and visit with us today, and he's going to show a presentation.
My name is Vincent Michael. I'm Executive Director of the Conservation Society of San Antonio. We rebranded ourselves a couple of years ago from San Antonio Conservation Society since people assumed we were part of the city. We're not. We're a private membership organization. I have brochures here. And we're also almost 100 years old. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, but then I know what Carol asked me to talk about is what we're working on now. So I'm going to tell a couple stories on the way. San Antonio is, of course, a wonderful place to work on history because the first public structure preserved for preservation purposes west of the Mississippi was the Alamo, way back in 1883. And of course, it was famously preserved not as it looked in the battle there with the missing parapet, but as the way the Army rebuilt it in 1849. And there was a big effort, of course, by two women, Adina de Zavala and Claire Driscoll, at the turn of the 20th century to really preserve it because they felt the state hadn't really done their job. And that's what caused the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. That's not where we come in. Our organization has started in the 1920s because there was street widening going on. And the way you widen the street is you made the street wider, and if there was a building in the way, you just sliced the front off of it. And the Commerce building there was actually slid back 16 feet so that it could be preserved, and it's still there. So these two women, Emily Edwards and Rena Maverick Green, saw a beautiful Greek temple called the Market House that was going to be demolished for the street widening, and they said, we should do something about it. So they found 11 other women, and those 13 women founded the San Antonio Conservation Society in March of 1924. One of the first things they did was, Emily Edwards was trained as an artist, so she put together these little puppets of the city council, and they created a little play in rhyming couplets where Mr. and Mrs. San Antonio argue about the future of the city, whether they should just pave it over for new development or preserve the things that made it wonderful. That's our current headquarters, the Wolf House, and down in the quarter is Mission San Jose. Because the society very quickly, even though it failed to save the Market House, was focused on a few things. It was focused on the river, the missions, which it felt were really in danger. And of course, at that time, Mission San Jose had no roof and so forth. And they got involved in efforts that Adina de Zavala and others were involved with to save the Spanish governor's palace in 1930. They were also involved in the creation of the Riverwalk. The architect Robert H. Hugman came to the Conservation Society in 1929 and said, here's my idea for the Riverwalk. The society lady said, wonderful, let's give it to the mayor and he will do it. And eventually it did happen 10 years later. At the same time, San Antonio preserved its first historic district, very early in the history of historic districts. Just a couple of years after New Orleans, they preserved La Villita, which includes the Coss House on the upper right, where General Martin Perfecte Coss surrendered to the Texians in December of 1835. And in fact, the plan to do La Villita originally included just 7 buildings, and they built a couple new buildings because they wanted to teach the youth under National Youth Administration skills like carpentry and textiles and ceramics. And the city wanted to expand La Villita, but they didn't always have the resources, so they asked the Conservation Society to help. So we bought the Dashiell House, that 1855 house on the lower left, in 1942. And then we purchased the Bomback House, the stone house on the right, which is now Little Ryan Prost House Restaurant, in 1950. We recently preserved the one in between. We also got involved in La Villita. Now, La Villita was funny. It was Maury Maverick who did it. And he was looking at Colonial Williamsburg, but he didn't want a dead museum for mincing scholars. He wanted something living and vital. And he even included an illustration of a mincing scholar in his law and contrasted it with the young couple doing the jitterbug. Appropriately, in 1948, the Conservation Society moved its Heritage Festival from the fall to the spring and moved it from the river up into La Villita. And since that time, we've done it, and it's called A Night in Old San Antonio. So our first effort was really at Mission San Jose. Mission San Jose, as I mentioned at the time, had lost its roof for over 100 years. In 1928, its tower fell down. What the ladies of the Conservation Society were able to do, and it was not easy to do, they were able to buy and restore the granary that was next to the Mission Church. And that restoration happened starting in 1930. They eventually sent workers over to help restore the church, which the archdiocese said it wasn't going to preserve. But then those workers had gotten enough work done on the church that the archdiocese changed its mind and ended up preserving Mission San Jose. So that was the beginning. By 1952, we had acquired the Steves Homestead, which we opened as a house museum in 1954. You may have read in the paper, we actually recently sold this after 70 years. And it's again going to be a private home. The other house museum that we still own, we acquired in 1961. This is the Ituri Edmonds house. It's an adobe brick house dating from 1859 on land that was purchased by Manuel Ituri Castillo in 1824 when they secularized Mission Concepcion. And that includes not only the house, which has been lovingly restored, 6 rooms interpreting late 19th century life, but also the mill, which was reconstructed about 1970 on the right. And we've moved a couple historic buildings to the site, including this lovely carriage house from 1883 that was moved there way back in 1964. The Conservation Society owns a number of properties. In addition to the 2 I already pointed out in La Villita, we also own the Gresser House in La Villita, and behind it, that building that we call the Alaskan Palace. It's sort of an Art Deco style. It's now Thai Lucky Restaurant, but it also includes our kitchen that we use for a night in Old San Antonio. Now, we're not really in the business of acquiring and owning all these properties. We purchased Casa Navarro, the home of Jose Antonio Navarro, who was one of the only Tejano who signed both the Texas Declaration of Independence and the Texas Constitution. And this was his home and office in Laredito on the near west side. We purchased that in 1959. Then we turned it over to the state in 1974, and the state still operates it as a museum. Conservation Society is also different from some other preservation organizations in that we've always been concerned about natural beauty. Our original purpose talked about physical structures, the heritage, historic preservation, but it also talked about the area's natural beauty and the customs, what we would today call intangible heritage. So we were always interested in parks. We helped save Travis Park from a plan in the 50s that would have taken down all the trees, dug down, built a parking lot underneath, and then put the park back on top. Of course, San Pedro Springs Park, one of the oldest in the country, which was set aside by the King of Spain in 1729. We also fought the highways in urban renewal. There's a famous story where Wanda Ford, who was the wife of O'Neill Ford, and she was president of the Conservation Society, and they had fought for 10 years with lawsuits and gotten in a lot of trouble to prevent the construction of 281. And then someone saw Wanda Ford driving on 281. And they said, "How could you after all that fighting?" She said, "I'm trying to wear it out." In 1967, we were involved in the creation of the first historic district in the state of Texas. Now, I mentioned La Villita. That eventually became an actual historic district where there was some regulation. But the first one was actually King William, where there had been a lot of people rehabbing these lovely old German mansions, including the James Gordon Riley's Kaltire house on the lower right. Alfred Giles, the architect who did the Steves Mansion, lived in the house on the upper right. And then this is the Altgeld house, one of the oldest houses in the district. The next districts included La Villita and Monte Vista, which is a lovely area of often large homes, about 10 miles and 112 feet north of downtown. Now, San Antonio, of course, hosted the first World's Fair in the Southwest. And it was also distinctive from other World's Fairs, Hemisphere 68, because unlike every other World's Fair, they preserved some buildings. Now, they tore most of them down. It was officially an urban renewal project, over 90 acres. But they did save 24 historic buildings, which they used as restaurants during the fair, and they're still in use today. The current Hemisphere Park operates, and the one on the left and the one on the right hopefully will be turned into something else soon. One of the most exciting things the Conservation Society did, and while I was born in San Antonio, I did not grow up in San Antonio, but I remember being in preservation a long time, seeing this on the cover of the preservation newspapers. In 1985, the Fairmount Hotel was moved 6 blocks over 6 days, including a trip on a bridge over the river. The largest structure at that point moved on rubber tires and settled into its new location next to La Villita with an addition that respects the original and is still restored today. And today there's a little rooftop bar as well. Other buildings that we got involved with but didn't continue to own included the Ursuline Academy, which we now know as Southwest School of Art, that UTSA just took over, and the Rand Building, which is sort of San Antonio's little Silicon Valley with a lot of tech companies in it. We purchased the Aztec Theater in 1988 and owned it for 5.5 years. We actually showed movies. We actually operated it when it's still a movie theater. Now it's a live performance venue. And we retain easements over all these properties, which means the owners have to talk to us if they're going to make significant changes to the outside. And in the case of the Aztec Theater, the inside is included as well. We even own this little clock on the corner of Houston Street, where the Hertzberg Jewelers used to be. It's a Hertzberg clock. We actually recently restored it, had it all repainted, and someone else who had a similar clock somewhere else in the United States, I don't remember, I want to say it's in Baltimore or somewhere, came and took casts from it so they could restore their clock. In the 1980s, we got involved in more diverse preservation, including the preservation of Ellis Alley, which was the cradle of the African-American east side of San Antonio. And these rundown buildings we helped restore. They're now centers for VIA, community organizations, and several local professionals. And for over 50 years, we've been giving out building grants. In fact, we're in a building grant cycle right now. You're eligible. It's on our website. We give about $50,000 to $100,000 each year in grants. They range from $5,000 to $10,000, occasionally a little more. And they're for exterior elements, things like porches, roofs, restoration of windows and doors, things like that. So there's some examples of that. And of course, despite losing a year and a half to COVID, we still do a night in Old San Antonio, which is our major fundraiser, as well being a cultural celebration in and of itself, which with its themed areas that celebrate the diverse history of San Antonio, from frontier town to Villa España, Mexican market, Sauerkraut Bend, Chinatown, and Froggy Bottom. For many years we did heritage education tours. These got interrupted by COVID too, because you couldn't just take 2,000 fourth graders out to see a mission at another historic site in a bus for a couple of years. We ended up doing virtual tours, which you can see on our website. We have several of the missions that we've done virtual tours in partnership with the Park Service, so that these fourth graders can also get a feeling for these places. And hopefully next year we'll be able to go back to the live heritage education tours, because they were wonderful. And I enjoyed giving them, because actually I find fourth graders are a great age. That's when they do Texas history. They're a great age because they're paying attention, they're asking questions, they're not all caught up in a social whirlwind yet, like they will be in a couple years. And they ask good questions, and they're quite interested in what you're showing them. One of our proudest achievements was World Heritage for the San Antonio Missions in 2015. And think about this going back in time. The Conservation Society was the leader in getting the San Antonio Missions created as a state historical park in 1941. In 1978, we got them designated as a national park, which is why when you go to the missions today, everyone's got their Smokey the Bear hats and uniforms to show you around. And then we started the process in 2006 to write the nomination that the San Antonio Missions be a World Heritage Site, which was achieved in 2015. And we continue to be involved in that. And part of the reason this is so wonderful, it wasn't just the buildings of the missions, it was the whole landscape as well. Part of the reason the missions were inscribed is that it wasn't just the mission church or even the mission complex itself. It was also the landscape. 2 of the acequia systems are still operating. One of them never stopped operating from 1745. And we actually helped with that too. We bought the land around the Spada Aqueduct back in the day to help preserve that aqueduct. So it's really exciting. We're also in the 21st century getting into more things that have to do with cultural heritage, that intangible heritage, or customs, as we said back in 1924. Here are the Monotines. You have some 60 different Monotine groups that come to Mission Concepcion in December for the Festival of the Virgin. And it's a wonderful cultural heritage tradition. One of the things we've also been dealing with in the last 5 or 6 years has been also intangible heritage. What happens when history and culture are in a place but not in the architecture? This is the Maltz House on Zarzamora on the west side of San Antonio. It opened in 1949, and everyone loves this place, but it was a drive-in. right? So you could have gone to this place every weekend for 25 years, had major milestones in your life occur there without ever getting out of your car. So is it the architecture? Now, unfortunately, the building was torn down. They did preserve those two signs. But that led to an effort where we partnered with the city to look at this question of living heritage or intangible heritage. And out of that came several things, including a legacy business program. This is Del Bravo Records on Old Highway 90. But there have been many dozens of Alamo Music Center, dozens of historic businesses have become part of this program in an effort to preserve things that aren't just buildings, but also really significant and have a long history in the community. Now I'm going to focus on a couple of our more recent efforts that are ongoing. These include Alamo Plaza, which since 2014 has been subject to the idea to reimagine Alamo Plaza. You've heard they wanted to create a world-class museum, they want to create a sense of reverence for the space, and to have people understand that there is a special place there and it's not just part of the city. So this, of course, started with, in 2017, with a design that everyone made fun of. They thought, well, we'll recreate the walls of the old Mission, which was a mission for 80 years and then a fort for 50 years, and then the center of the city for 170 years. They said, we'll put glass walls up. And of course, these were people from Philadelphia. They didn't think about our climate. And we all said, what are you trying to do? Toaster oven all the tourists. What, with these glass walls? So, we were more concerned specifically when the state in 2015 purchased 3 buildings. The Crockett building you see on the lower right, built in 1882 by Alfred Giles. The Woolworth building on the upper right, built in 1921 by Adams and Adams. Because they were trying to reclaim the footprint of the Alamo battlefield. And I always thought this was kind of curious because they got these 3 buildings on the west side, and yes, there was Losoya House here. Travis was living here in one of the structures along the wall. But the really important part of the battle happened up here on the north wall, which is under the Federal Building Post Office. That's where Santa Ana broke through. And this is where Travis fell, right up here. He came running out of his house, and died 90 seconds into the battle, shot in the head. And then this is where it then finished up over here at the Long Barracks and the chapel. So from an interpretive point of view, this is important, but I think the state was just saying, well, we can buy these buildings, we can't buy these. And we asked them, why didn't they do augmented reality? When we restored Mission San Jose back in 1930, we rebuilt many of the walls, and you could see that. You could see where the original walls ended and where the rebuilding in 1930 happened. But we're in the 21st century. You don't need to build everything all the time. You can do augmented reality, where you can just walk around and swipe your phone or your tablet and see what something looked like in the past. Interestingly, we had a meeting just yesterday afternoon with the Alamo people, and they are going to be doing this. They are going to be having augmented reality as part of their interpretation. Now, we were especially focused on the Woolworth building, not only because it's a lovely example of what we call Chicago commercial architecture, and it has everything except its original sign. All the terracotta, all the brick, all the windows are all still there. But it was also very important in civil rights history. This is Mary Lillian Andrews, who was a 17-year-old freshman at Our Lady of the Lake when the sit-in movement happened to try to integrate lunch counters in 1960, starting in Greensboro, North Carolina. In February, she wrote letters. She was a San Antonio freshman at Our Lady of the Lake. She wrote letters to the downtown lunch counter saying, please integrate. And then they had a big meeting, and they said, okay, we're going to have a sit-in on Thursday. And of course, we know how that happened in other parts of Texas and around the country. But San Antonio did something different. The business and religious leaders got together on Tuesday, and all the lunch counters were open and integrated on Wednesday. So there was never a sit-in. There wasn't any violence, and San Antonio was the only place that did a peaceful and voluntary sit-in. So we organized a coalition of people to help preserve this building and this story. Here they are marching in the Martin Luther King Day March in January 2019. First peaceful voluntary Woolworth lunch counter integration, 1960. And then we also came up with our own plan. One of the things I've learned in many, many years in historic preservation and in architecture and stuff is you've got to give people a picture. Yeah. And the Alamo people hadn't drawn a picture of their new museum yet. So that gave us an opportunity. We said, why don't we draw a picture of it, including the Woolworth and Crockett buildings? They said a world-class building needed to be 130,000 square feet. So first of all, we reminded them of the other buildings that the wall was under. And by the way, there is no remnant of the wall. All the buildings on the west side have 15-foot basements. So they're archaeologically, there's nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, okay, so this 90,000 square feet, we had 40,000 square feet, step it up and back, and that can be the new museum. And they said, well, you have to see where the west wall was. We're like, well, why do that outdoors? Why not do it in the shade? Just carve a hole through it, you can walk along where the west wall was. Interestingly, we were in that meeting yesterday. They showed us the first image I've seen of the museum, and it looks a heck of a lot like this. We also got state antiquities landmark status for the Woolworth Building in 2019, going up to Austin with members of the local San Antonio branch of the NAACP. And then in October of 2019, for Muertos Fest in Hemisphere, we did an ofrenda to Mary Lillian Andrews. She died quite young, unfortunately, but her brother was still alive, and he worked with us, and the NAACP worked with us. And we got a local artist to continue. You see, you got the top of the Woolworth Building above her name, and there's her picture. And the neat thing about this is there was actually a prize for the best ofrenda, and we won second place. We beat Selena, which I couldn't believe. You know. Actually, this won't play loud enough, but I'm going to turn this on. So then just a few days after this happened, we had also been working behind the scenes to try to save the Woolworth Building. And because of the World Heritage status, we contacted World Monuments Fund, based in New York since 1965. And we got the San Antonio Woolworth Building on the same list as Notre Dame de Paris, Easter Island, and Machu Picchu. It was part of the World Monuments Watch List for 2020. 25 structures in the world, only 3 in the United States, and 1 is San Antonio Woolworth. And if you think I'm being ridiculous, here's what Architectural Digest said, and unfortunately the way this is, you can't quite read it, but it basically said it includes icons like Easter Island, Machu Picchu, and lesser known sites like the civil rights site of San Antonio Woolworth Building. And they put it in their magazine. This immediately led to several things happening. The Judge Nelson Wolff got above the fold in the paper saying save the Woolworth Building. We got a meeting with George P. Bush, the General Land Office in Austin, brought along the NAACP. And then we also got money to do events from World Monuments Fund, so we did a wonderful symposium on February 1st, the 60th anniversary of that very first sit-in in Greensboro. And we had speakers including our own Everett Fly, fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, Tara Dudley from the University of Texas at Austin, Bruce Winders, who'd been the curator of the Alamo for almost 20 years, Todd Moy from the University of North Texas, and Catherine O'Rourke from our own Trinity University. And meanwhile, the Alamo had gone and hired this firm called John Waite to see whether these buildings could actually be restored. And the report finally came back and said they're in great shape. Yes, you can restore them. A hurricane wouldn't knock them down. The state might knock them down, but the hurricane wouldn't. So that came out in October of 2020. By that time, the CEO of the Alamo Trust had resigned, and things were looking better. We worked with groups to celebrate the anniversary of the lunch counter integration, and I had a wonderful experience. We were putting together 2 videos, which you can also see on our website. One talks about the sit-in movement throughout Texas and how San Antonio was different, and the other just focuses on what happened in San Antonio. And I got a call as we were producing those films. And the guy, it was from California, some sculpture center, he said, do you have anyone who was at the Woolworth on that day of the integration? I said, no, we haven't found anyone. He goes, well, I have someone for you. And it turns out this guy, Richard Howland Hunt, was a very prominent sculptor already. He was a young man, he was like 23. He had drafted in the Army, was at Fort Sam Houston, was actually exhibiting. He had already exhibited in New York. He was exhibiting in San Antonio as well. and he knew the architect Allison Peary. And on the day he had gone to the meeting where they said they were going to start doing a sit-in, and Allison Peary called him up on the Wednesday and said, let's go down and have lunch at Woolworth. So he went, and the guy who was writing his biography said, I've been interviewing you for a year and a half. Why didn't you tell me that you were part of this moment in history? It's like, well, nothing happened. We went in, we ate lunch.
Yeah.
No one poured coffee on our head, we didn't get arrested, nothing happened. But that was the point of San Antonio's story.
Yeah, nothing bad happened.
So he actually, you hear his voice in our video because we were able to interview him over the phone. So these are little videos that you can see on our website for free. There's Mary Lillian Andrews, and I would encourage you to do that. So by May of 2021, Bexar County had announced $25 million in money for the Alamo Museum in the Woolworth and Crockett buildings, including interpretation of the lunch counter. And one of the interesting things is that part of the argument the Alamo had been making before, they said, well, there were 7 lunch counters integrated that day. Why was Woolworth so important? And a lot of people said, well, that was the corner where everyone met to catch the exposition bus on the way home. And that was the symbol, Woolworth, of the sit-in movement. Plus, it turns out, of all the 6 surviving buildings, only in the Woolworth can you actually see where the lunch counter was on the ground. It's the only one that has a physical remnant of it. So we continue to be involved in a lot of ongoing projects. Our tricentennial project, which hasn't happened, was to help restore the Pump House #1 in Brackenridge Park, which was built in 1877, arguably one of the oldest industrial buildings in the state. San Pedro Creek we're very involved in. We continue to work with Hemisphere as they continue to repurpose those buildings that were saved. We were a friend of the court in the lawsuit that saved the Hay Street Bridge and the land around it. And we've gotten involved in more modern buildings as well. The Wood Courthouse, which was originally the U.S. Pavilion, the Confluence Theater during Hemisphere, has been part of our watch list for a while. And more recently, you might have seen in the newspaper a week or so ago, we've really been worried about the Institute for Texan Cultures. And it's tough because this is a mid-century modern building, but it's what some people call a brutalist building. It's not a lovely, pretty building. It can be somewhat foreboding. It was supposed to be, the idea when they designed it was supposed to be a temple rising up. But it was also this wonderful ethnographic museum that channeled together all the different cultures that formed Texas. And so we've actually been working with a committee that's very excited to try to help preserve that building, and more people keep coming in. Now, we're just not about modern buildings. We've also been very involved in the efforts to save the Las Jacales. The oldest structures are only probably 8 in the county left. These are these early adobe structures. This is one on what was Perez Street behind Green Hospital. This is what it looked like. We put a cover over it to save it in 1999. And then after almost 20 years, the cover started to fall on it. But finally, the hospital restored it. This is the little Postert house that is actually at our Arturi Edmond site. We also led an effort starting in the 1980s to document gas stations in San Antonio, of which there's so many, and many are beautiful. And the other interesting thing to me is many have been turned into restaurants, including these 3 are all restaurants. In fact, I did a calculation, and I've got a volunteer working on it now, that I could take you to breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a full week at a different place each time, and it'd always be in a gas station. We actually got especially involved in this 1935 Pure Oil gas station on Nogalitos right by San Pedro Creek. And we actually hired architects again to come up with drawings showing how it could be saved, and eventually got the Power Preservation Foundation to lease the building from the owner. They've restored the roof. They're starting to white box the interior, so that's been an important save. We're involved in a lot of neighborhood issues of zoning, new and old next to each other, issues of demolition, which happen a lot. We've been involved in wonderful neighborhood workshops where we help teach community people how to talk to developers, how to talk to the city, how to say something besides, no, we don't want it, or it's too tall, it's too big, how to create a more nuanced conversation so they can get things. This even led us to creating a board game called Plots and Plats, where everyone's a developer, they get $1 million, and they can either take a shortcut and skip community input and try to get it through the various zoning boards and historic boards and city council, or they can take a longer route and then they get better odds when they go up against the boards because they've talked to the community. There's still losses. We tried to save Beacon Hill School from 1916 by the architect Leo Dielman, showed what it could be, but it was demolished a few years back. The The state came in and demolished the Sutton building, to everyone's surprised, in July of 2019 on no notice at all. So we really deal with a lot of that. And if you map this, we mapped it, this is the historic district of Monte Vista on the top, the historic district of Tobin Hill below. Look what happens if you're not in the historic district. Everything not in the district is on fire and being torn down. Here are a couple more buildings on Broadway and in Tobin Hill that just went down. Plus, we deal with challenges like, and really the city deals with it more than we do, but we do get involved because they're the regulatory body. We're just a private membership group. People coming in, getting a permit for one thing and doing something else. This reached a pitch in 2021 when we had like 20 statements before City Council and the Historic and Design Review Committee in 1 month. Another interesting project that I was just in a very good meeting on this morning has been in the San Pedro Creek work next to the Alameda Theater at Houston Street at Cameron, or however you pronounce it. They found the foundations of St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church, including the 1875 cornerstone, which is still legible. And so we've been working with the River Authority, with the Army Corps of Engineers, with St. James Church to come up with a good way to interpret that space. And initially they were going to get rid of most of the foundations, but now fortunately the plan has been changed. So when the cultural park opens, you'll be able to walk in and like stand in that space that was the church and see where the cornerstone was. We also helped get the Alazan Apache courts, which are public housing, but they're very early public housing from 1940 on the National Trust 11 most endangered list. And we work with a lot of community partners like Westside Preservation Alliance, Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. We tried to save this building at 503 Urban Loop, which had a really interesting history. It was built as a brothel. And this is the famous Fanning Porter brothel where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and Paul Newman riding the bicycle, that all happened here. And then it was bought by the Archdiocese and spent 100 years as an orphanage and daycare. So it was, 30 years with sinners, 100 with saints, I don't know. And we tried to save it because it was one of the last buildings left of Laredito, but it had been boarded up. And unfortunately, during the coldest day of the year, and back in February, there were homeless people camping in, and the whole thing burned down. It burned for like a day. It was amazing. On a happier note, this building came up for possible demolition. Beautiful 1912 sort of prairie-style Hughes house up by San Antonio College, and it was surrounded by parking lots of San Antonio College. And it was owned by the Archdiocese, and thanks to a 2019 state law, if you're a religious entity, you don't have to follow all the regular rules when it comes to property. So they could have just demolished it and turned the land over to San Antonio College. So we did two things. Well, three things. We got involved, talked to the community, started finding people who are interested in it. Secondly, we wrote to San Antonio College, said, please don't buy this to have it torn down. Third, we wrote to the Archbishop. We said, please put it on the market. Maybe someone wants to buy it and save it. Well, San Antonio College wrote back and said, okay, we have no interest in it. And the Archdiocese indeed put it on the market. I was riding my bike by one day and there's a sign, it's for sale. So I called up some of the people who were interested. And eventually I got contacted through my blog by a woman who said, oh, I want to buy it, but I'm not sure we have enough money to restore it. And I'm like, who are you? Her name was May Chu, and she partnered with one of the other people we had talked to, Andrew Weissman, the chef, Chef Andrew Weissman, and they bought it and are going to save it. They want to do like a wine bar experience on the first floor. And not only that, but when that happened, we decided we better write another letter to the Archbishop, say thank you. So we did, and he wrote a thank you back, which was really nice. So our current efforts remain the Institute of Texan Cultures. As I said, we've got sort of a coalition, a diverse coalition that's working to try to figure out what to do with that property. UTSA sort of wanted to get rid of it. They fired most of the staff a couple of years ago. It's sort of a shell of what it was. And it may have to be something else. It may not be the Institute. It may have to be something else, but that's one of our efforts. We continue to be involved in Alamo Plaza. I don't know if you saw the paper about a week and a half ago, but their latest plan is to restore the lunette and south gate of Alamo Plaza. So this is the lunette here. The south gate, there's a lot of archaeological evidence for, and the south gate actually survived up until about 1871 when the city purchased it and tore it down. So They had a long history, but the lunette, which was built by the Mexicans when they occupied in 1835, was only up for less than 2 years. So we had a meeting yesterday with the Alamo. We have concerns that this is too big and it's going to draw attention away from the rest of the site. So my next slide says that preservation is reuse, but I would also say that preservation is partnerships, because so much of our success comes not just from having good strategies and knowing when to use architects and drawings, but also reaching out to a lot of other people. So when you show up at an important meeting, it's not just a bunch of crazy building people, it's a broad base of the community. So that's the story of the Conservation Society and what we're up to today. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I brought some brochures and love to have you all as members.